The summer heat in Richmond, Virginia, was unbearable on that August morning in 1855. The air hung thick and heavy, pressing down on the cobblestone streets of Shockoe Bottom like an invisible weight. Even at dawn, you could feel it, the suffocating humidity that made your shirt cling to your back, that made breathing feel like swallowing hot syrup. But it wasn't just the heat that made people uncomfortable that day. It was something else. Something that would shake the very foundations of Richmond society and expose secrets that some of the most powerful men in Virginia had spent fortunes to keep buried. I need you to understand something before we go any further. What I'm about to tell you isn't some romanticized tale from history. This is a story about the darkest chapter of American history, slavery, but it's also a story about humanity, dignity, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding one particular auction that took place in Richmond's largest slave market. An auction that, according to historical whispers and fragmented records, involved the most physically striking enslaved man ever brought to the auction block in that city. An auction that would set off a chain of events so scandalous that certain records mysteriously disappeared and certain prominent families went to extraordinary lengths to erase any connection to what happened that day. Richmond, Virginia in 1855 was not just any southern city. It was the second largest slave trading center in the entire United States, surpassed only by New Orleans. Every single day, between 30 and 50 human beings were bought and sold in Richmond's auction houses. Can you imagine that? 50 people. Every single day. Fathers torn from daughters. Mothers separated from sons. Husbands ripped away from wives. This wasn't happening in some distant abstract past. This was less than 200 years ago. People were being commodified, inspected like livestock, their worth determined by the strength of their backs, the smoothness of their skin, the potential for bearing children who would themselves be enslaved. The Shockoe Bottom district was where this horror unfolded daily. Brick buildings lined the narrow streets, their facades hiding the human suffering contained within. These weren't just buildings, they were holding pens, auction houses, and what the traders euphemistically called slave jails. Behind those walls, thousands upon thousands of people waited in chains, not knowing if they would ever see their families again, not knowing what plantation or what fate awaited them after the hammer fell at auction. The major traders in Richmond had names that appeared in the society pages, names that were respected in business circles: Robert Lumpkin, Silas Omohundro, Hector Davis. These men became extraordinarily wealthy from human trafficking. They built mansions. They married into prominent families. They sat in church pews on Sunday mornings. And Monday through Saturday they bought and sold human beings for profit. The cognitive dissonance required to do this, to separate your Sunday Christianity from your weekday brutality, is something that should stagger us even today. But August 1855 was different. Something happened that month that would be whispered about for years afterward, though you'll struggle to find it in official records. That's because certain people went to great lengths to erase it from history. What we know comes from fragments: diary entries, letters, newspaper advertisements that suddenly stopped running, and testimonies given decades later by elderly formerly enslaved people who remembered the chaos that ensued. It started with a shipment of enslaved people brought up from South Carolina. This wasn't unusual. The domestic slave trade was booming in the 1850s. After the United States officially banned the importation of enslaved people from Africa in 1808, the domestic trade exploded. Virginia itself became a major exporter of enslaved people to the Deep South. Families that had been in Virginia for generations were being separated and sold downriver, a phrase that struck terror into the hearts of enslaved communities because it meant being sold to the brutal cotton and sugar plantations of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama, where working conditions were even more deadly than in Virginia. This particular shipment contained approximately 40 people. Men, women, and children shackled together, forced to walk or travel by train to Richmond, where they would be processed at one of the major auction houses. Among them was a young man whose name has been lost to history, but whose physical appearance was so striking that even the hardened slave traders took notice. According to accounts that survived, he was in his early 20s, exceptionally tall, with features that one witness described as refined beyond his station, which was the racist language of the time attempting to grapple with someone who defied their dehumanizing stereotypes. Now here's where the story gets complicated, and where we need to talk about the uncomfortable reality of what enslaved people, particularly enslaved women, endured. Because physical appearance in the slave market wasn't just a casual observation, it directly affected price and destination. Enslaved people who were considered attractive, particularly women, were often purchased not primarily for field work but for domestic service and, tragically, for sexual exploitation by their enslavers. This is one of the most horrific aspects of slavery that history classes often gloss over. Enslaved women had no legal right to refuse sexual advances from their enslavers. Rape was not considered a crime when the victim was enslaved. The children born from these assaults were themselves considered property. Men who were considered physically attractive faced different, but equally dehumanizing treatment. They might be used as house servants, where their appearance would reflect well on the enslaver's status. Some enslavers, particularly wealthy widows or wives of absent plantation owners, would exploit enslaved men sexually, though this was spoken about even less than the systematic sexual abuse of enslaved women. And then there was something else, something that proper Richmond society definitely didn't discuss openly, but that everyone knew existed: a market for enslaved people destined for the pleasure houses and brothels that operated in cities throughout the South. The young man brought to Richmond that August was placed in the holding pen of Dickinson, Hill and Company, one of the largest slave trading firms in the city. The standard procedure was to keep newly arrived enslaved people for a period of preparation before auction. This meant they would be given better food to improve their physical condition, they would be coached on how to behave during examination and auction, to look strong, to smile when inspected, to not show defiance, because defiance lowered your price. They would be given different clothing. Any visible wounds or scars would be treated with ointments or, in some cases, hidden with cosmetics. But something unusual happened with this particular individual. The traders began to argue among themselves about how to market him. See, a prime field hand, a young, strong man suitable for heavy agricultural labor, could sell for anywhere from $1,200 to $1,800 in 1855. That was an enormous sum of money. To put it in perspective, a skilled craftsman might make $300 a year. But there were whispers that this particular individual could fetch significantly more if sold through a different channel. A private sale, perhaps, to a buyer whose purposes for purchasing a human being were not agricultural in nature. This is where the historical record gets deliberately murky. What we know is that news of this upcoming auction began to circulate through Richmond society in unusual ways. Advertisements appeared in newspapers, which was normal, but the language in these advertisements was unusual. They emphasized extraordinary physical specimen and exceptional refinement of feature. Coded language that told certain readers exactly what kind of auction this would be. Within days, word had spread not just through Richmond but to slave buyers from as far away as Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. The day of the auction arrived, and something unprecedented happened. The auction house, which normally could accommodate around 200 people, was absolutely mobbed. Over 300 people tried to cram into that space. Witnesses later reported that the crowd included not just the usual plantation owners and their agents, but an unusual number of Richmond's wealthiest citizens, including people who had never before attended a slave auction. Even more shocking, there were women present, wealthy white women, heavily veiled to hide their identities, which was extremely unusual for a slave auction. The auction began with the other enslaved people from the same shipment. One by one, they were brought to the auction block, a wooden platform about 3 feet high that sat in the center of the auction house. Each person was forced to stand there while the auctioneer described their attributes. Good teeth. Strong back. Field hand. 20 years old. No known defects. The bidding would start, hands would raise, and within minutes, a human being's fate would be decided. Families were separated. A mother was sold to one buyer, her 3 children to another. The children screamed and had to be physically restrained. This was just another Tuesday in Richmond, Virginia. But then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The young man was brought out, and according to every account that survives, the room fell absolutely silent. Not the excited murmur of bidders assessing merchandise, but stunned, uncomfortable silence. He was brought to the auction block barefoot, wearing only simple cotton trousers, wrists bound. But his posture, multiple witnesses noted, was different. While most enslaved people on that block showed defeat, exhaustion, or terror in their body language, because who wouldn't in that circumstance, this young man stood straight. His head was up. His eyes, one witness wrote in a letter discovered years later, gazed not at the floor but directly into the crowd, and there was something in that gaze that made men of considerable power shift uncomfortably. The auctioneer began his description, and this is where things took a turn toward the scandalous. He emphasized the young man's appearance and language that went beyond the usual clinical descriptions of slave auctions. He noted classical features, exceptional physical development, unusual refinement of bearing. This wasn't the language of someone selling a field hand. This was something else entirely, and everyone in that room knew it. The bidding started at $2,000, already higher than the usual opening bid for field hands. The first bid came from a plantation agent representing a cotton planter from Mississippi. But immediately, another voice called out $2,500. This came from a man in expensive clothing sitting near the front. Then another bid from someone in the back. $2,700. $3,000. The price kept climbing in increments that shocked the room. $4,000. $5,000. The crowd began to murmur. What was happening? At $6,000, more than 4 times the price of a prime field hand, something happened that had never occurred in Richmond's slave market before. A prominent Richmond merchant named Thaddeus Lockwood stood up and shouted $7,000. The room went absolutely silent because everyone knew who Thaddeus Lockwood was. He was in his late 50s, a widower, a man of immense wealth and standing in Richmond society. He was not a plantation owner. He had no need for agricultural labor. So, why was he bidding such an astronomical sum? But then another voice rang out. $8,000. This came from a representative of a wealthy Charleston widow known in society circles for her collection of house servants, who were selected, rumor said, for attributes that had nothing to do with their ability to cook or clean. The bidding war was now between these two parties, and the tension in the room was palpable. $9,000. $10,000. People began to stand up to see who was bidding. The auctioneer was sweating profusely, not just from the heat, but from the sheer unprecedented nature of what was happening. At $12,000, Thaddeus Lockwood stood up again and declared, $15,000. The room gasped. $15,000 was more than most houses in Richmond cost. It was a fortune. And it made absolutely clear that whatever Lockwood intended to purchase this young man for, it had nothing to do with picking cotton. The Charleston representative conferred quietly with her agent, shook her head, and withdrew from the bidding. Lockwood had won. But that's when everything went wrong. As the auctioneer was about to bring down the hammer to finalize the sale, a voice from the back of the room shouted, "I object to this sale." Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a white woman, her face flushed red, wearing the expensive dress and jewelry of Richmond's upper class. She pushed her way through the crowd, and several people recognized her. She was Catherine Waverly, the wife of Richard Waverly, one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Virginia. "That man," she said, pointing at the young man on the auction block, "is my husband's son." The room exploded. People shouted. Some tried to rush toward the woman. Others toward the door. The auctioneer banged his gavel desperately, trying to restore order. And the young man on the auction block, his face showed the first crack in his stoic composure. Because if what this woman said was true, it meant everything. It meant his mother had been raped by Richard Waverly. It meant he was half-white by blood. It meant that one of Virginia's most prominent families had a secret that could destroy their social standing. But more than that, if he was Richard Waverly's son, he might not be legally enslaved at all. There were complicated laws in Virginia about the children of enslaved mothers and white fathers. Most such children were still considered enslaved, but if the father had made any provisions, if there was any documentation, if there had been any promises made, it could complicate the sale. More importantly, having a white father who was a prominent citizen, even if that father wouldn't acknowledge him, created a social crisis that Richmond's elite were not prepared to handle in such a public manner. Catherine Waverley was quickly escorted out of the auction house, but the damage was done. Thaddeus Lockwood withdrew his bid. The Charleston representative's agent had already left. The auctioneer tried to resume the bidding, but no one would bid now. The scandal was too hot. Whoever purchased this young man would be purchasing a human being who might be the son of Richard Waverley, and that would create social complications that even $15,000 wasn't worth. The auction house descended into chaos. The enslaved man was taken back to the holding pen. The remaining enslaved people scheduled to be auctioned that day were held back. The auction was suspended, and Richmond society began to tear itself apart over what had just happened. Because Catherine Waverley hadn't just made an accusation, she had done it publicly, in front of 300 witnesses, many of whom were part of Richmond's social elite. She had violated the unspoken rule that such matters were never, ever discussed in public, even when everyone knew they were happening. But why did she do it? This is where the mystery deepens and where we have to piece together fragments of evidence. Over the following weeks, bits of the story emerged. Catherine Waverley had been married to Richard Waverley for 26 years. They had 3 legitimate children. But Richard also owned over 200 enslaved people on his plantation south of Richmond, and he had a long-standing relationship with an enslaved woman named Sarah. Catherine knew about it. Everyone knew about it. But according to the horrible social conventions of the time, wives of enslavers were expected to simply accept that their husbands raped enslaved women. It was considered part of the burden of being a plantation mistress, something they were supposed to endure with silent dignity. But Sarah's son, the young man who had just nearly been sold for $15,000, was different. According to letters that later surfaced, Richard Waverley had shown unusual interest in this child as he grew up. He had even taught him to read, which was illegal in Virginia. He had made certain he was trained in skilled work rather than being sent to the fields. And most damning of all, there were rumors that Richard had told Sarah he would free their son when he turned 21. He had allegedly promised this multiple times, even putting it in writing at one point. But Richard Waverley had gambling debts. Massive gambling debts. His plantation was mortgaged. And at some point, he made the decision to sell Sarah's son south, breaking whatever promises he had made. Sarah somehow got word to Catherine, perhaps hoping that the wife might have some shred of mercy that the husband lacked. And Catherine, for reasons we can only speculate about, perhaps she had finally had enough of her husband's betrayals, perhaps she felt some complicated sympathy for Sarah, perhaps she simply wanted to humiliate her husband publicly, decided to act. The aftermath of that auction was extraordinary. Richard Waverley initially denied everything, but too many people had heard his wife's accusation. He tried to sue her for defamation, but she counterclaimed and threatened to expose even more of his affairs. The case never went to trial because his lawyers advised him it would be social suicide. Instead, a settlement was reached behind closed doors. Catherine Waverley would receive a separate maintenance, essentially a financial separation while remaining legally married. And the young man at the center of it all? This is where the trail goes cold in a suspicious way. The usual auction house records for August 1855 are mysteriously incomplete. The page that should contain the record of that auction has been torn out of the ledger book, which is now stored in Virginia's state archives. Multiple historians have noted this suspicious gap. Newspaper advertisements for the auction exist up until the day before it was scheduled, but there's no coverage of what actually happened. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It happens when powerful people work to suppress information. We have one account from an elderly formerly enslaved person interviewed in 1937 as part of the Federal Writers Project. She had been a young girl in Richmond in 1855 and remembered hearing the adults talking in whispers about the beautiful boy who caused the great scandal. She remembered that he had disappeared from Richmond shortly after the auction, but she didn't know where he had gone. Some people said he had been spirited away to Philadelphia by abolitionists. Others said Richard Waverley had secretly purchased him back through an intermediary and sent him to a plantation in Texas, where no one would know the story. Still others whispered that Thaddeus Lockwood had purchased him in a private sale after all, and the young man had lived the rest of his life in a complicated and undoubtedly exploitative arrangement in Lockwood's Richmond mansion. We don't know, and that's part of the tragedy. A human being who caused such a scandal, who was at the center of an event that rocked Richmond society, doesn't even have his name preserved in the historical record. He was denied his identity in life, and he was denied his identity in history. That's what slavery did. It erased people. It erased their names, their stories, their humanity. We have more detailed records of the sale of horses in Richmond in 1855 than we have of this man's fate. But the incident had ripples. Catherine Waverley became something of a pariah in Richmond society. Women of her social class quietly admired her for speaking out, but they couldn't associate with her publicly without risking their own social standing. She lived the rest of her life in relative isolation, supported by her settlement but excluded from society events. Richard Waverley's reputation was permanently damaged. He lost his position on several important boards. His plantation continued to decline financially. When he died in 1859, just 4 years later, the entire estate was sold at auction to cover his debts, and all the enslaved people he had owned, including presumably Sarah, were sold and scattered. Thaddeus Lockwood, the man who had bid $15,000, also faced consequences. Questions about his intentions in trying to purchase the young man circulated in Richmond society. His business suffered as some people quietly withdrew their patronage. He never married, and when he died in 1868, his will made several mysterious provisions, including a substantial sum of money to be delivered to a certain person in Philadelphia, but the lawyer executing the will left no record of who that person was. And what about the broader implications of this story? Because this wasn't just about one auction or one young man. This incident pulled back the curtain on aspects of slavery that white Southern society desperately wanted to keep hidden. The fact that so many wealthy white men had children with enslaved women was an open secret, but it was supposed to remain unspoken. Catherine Waverley's public accusation threatened to expose the massive hypocrisy of a society that claimed enslaved people were an inferior race while simultaneously raping enslaved women and then enslaving their own biological children. It also exposed the reality of what we might call the sexual economy of slavery. The enormous bid that Lockwood made revealed that there was a market for enslaved people that had nothing to do with agricultural labor. That market had always existed, but it operated in shadows. Auction houses knew about it, but kept it quiet. Certain enslaved people, particularly women but also men, were sold into situations of sexual exploitation, and everyone involved worked to maintain a fiction that this wasn't happening. But when the bidding on that young man reached $15,000, the fiction became impossible to maintain. Everyone in that room knew exactly what was happening, and for a brief moment, they couldn't pretend otherwise. The Richmond newspapers handled the scandal carefully. There were no detailed articles, but in the weeks following, several newspapers ran editorials about the proper conduct expected at public auctions and the dangers of emotional outbursts that could disrupt commercial proceedings. One paper even published an essay on the regrettable necessity of maintaining social order and not allowing personal grievances to interfere with established economic institutions. These were coded messages to other wives. Do not do what Catherine Waverley did. Keep your silence. Maintain the system. But the enslaved community knew what had happened, and they told the story among themselves. For enslaved people, the incident was both hopeful and tragic. Hopeful because it showed that the system could be disrupted, that even the most powerful white men were vulnerable to exposure. Tragic because it demonstrated that even when secrets were revealed, the enslaved person at the center of the scandal still had no power over their own fate. The white people involved argued among themselves, settled their scores, arranged their financial settlements, and moved on with their lives, but the young man who started it all simply disappeared into historical obscurity. Think about what this story reveals about the nature of slavery. This wasn't just an economic system, though it was certainly that. It wasn't just a racist system, though it was definitely that. It was also a system built on sexual exploitation, on the absolute power of enslavers to do whatever they wanted with the bodies of enslaved people. And it was a system that required constant maintenance of elaborate social fictions. The fiction that enslaved people were happy in their condition. The fiction that enslavers treated enslaved people well. The fiction that slavery was a benevolent institution. And the fiction that the mixed-race children being born on plantations throughout the South were somehow not evidence of systematic rape. Richmond in 1855 was a city built on these fictions. The beautiful architecture, the elegant society, the churches and theaters and social clubs, all of it was funded by the slave trade. Between 1840 and 1860, Richmond traders sold an estimated 40,000 enslaved people. 40,000 human beings passed through those auction houses, were examined, were sold, were shipped to plantations throughout the South. Families were destroyed. Children were orphaned. Husbands and wives were separated forever. And the money from all of that misery built the city that Richmond's white citizens were so proud of. The incident of August 1855 was a crack in the facade. For just a moment, the machinery of slavery jammed. The usual procedures broke down. The secrets that everyone knew but no one spoke about came spilling out into public view. And Richmond's elite responded by doing what they always did. They suppressed the information, tore pages out of ledgers, stopped newspaper coverage, and worked to restore the system to normal functioning. Within weeks, the auctions were running again just as before. Enslaved people continued to be bought and sold. The machine of slavery ground on. But the people who were there that day never forgot what they had seen. In the decades after the Civil War, when formerly enslaved people began to tell their stories, this incident came up again and again in different forms. Sometimes the details were different. Memory is imperfect, and oral histories told decades later can blend different events together. But the core of the story remained consistent. There had been an auction of an exceptionally handsome young man. There had been shockingly high bids. There had been a scandal involving a white woman's accusation, and the young man had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Some historians have been skeptical of this story because the documentation is so fragmentary. And it's true that we don't have the kind of concrete evidence that we might want. But that's precisely the point. The evidence is fragmentary because powerful people worked to destroy it. The reason we don't have complete records is because those records were deliberately made incomplete. The absence of evidence is itself evidence of a cover-up. And even if every specific detail of this story isn't perfectly accurate, even if the bid didn't reach exactly $15,000, even if some of the names have been changed or forgotten over time, the fundamental truth remains. Events like this happened. Enslaved people who were considered attractive were sold into sexual exploitation. White men raped enslaved women and then enslaved their own children. Wives knew about it and were expected to remain silent. And when someone broke the code of silence, powerful forces moved to suppress the information and restore the system. The young man at the center of this story represents hundreds, perhaps thousands, of enslaved people whose stories have been lost because they were deliberately erased from history. We don't know his name. We don't know his fate. We don't know if he ever gained his freedom, if he lived a long life or died young, if he ever got to tell his own story. What we know is that his physical appearance made him valuable in a market that treated human beings as commodities, that his existence exposed uncomfortable truths that Richmond society wanted to keep hidden, and that he vanished from a historical record in a way that seems far too convenient to be accidental. The mystery of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in Richmond isn't really about one person or one auction. It's about a system that was fundamentally built on dehumanization, exploitation, and sexual violence. It's about the elaborate social structures that enabled and maintained that system. And it's about the way that even today, more than 150 years after slavery was abolished, we're still uncovering the stories that were buried, still finding the evidence that was hidden, still trying to understand the full horror of what happened. When you walk through Richmond today, you can still see some of the buildings where slave auctions took place. They've been converted into restaurants, shops, apartments. There are historical markers, but they're often discreet, easy to miss. The city has struggled with how to acknowledge this history, how to tell the truth about what happened in those buildings without making tourists uncomfortable. It's a microcosm of America's broader struggle with the legacy of slavery. We know we should confront it, we know it's important, but we're never quite sure how to do it in a way that doesn't require us to fundamentally rethink our national mythology. The incident of 1855 matters because it shows us how slavery functioned not just as an economic system, but as a social system built on secrets, silence, and the absolute power of some human beings over others. It shows us how that system commodified every aspect of human existence, including and especially sexuality. It shows us how white women were complicit in the system even as they were also, in a different way, victimized by it, expected to maintain their silence about their husbands' rapes of enslaved women. And it shows us how the system worked to erase evidence of its own crimes. Think about Catherine Waverley for a moment. History hasn't been kind to her either. We know her name only because it appeared in a few private letters and because one newspaper made a coded reference to regrettable outburst by a prominent lady. Was she a hero for speaking out? Was she acting out of compassion for the enslaved young man and his mother? Or was she simply a spurned wife using enslaved people as pawns in her marital dispute? Probably some complicated combination of all of these things. But the fact that she had to be escorted out of the auction house, the fact that she became a social pariah, the fact that she couldn't safely make her accusation without facing serious consequences, all of that tells us something about how the system policed itself and punished anyone who threatened to expose its secrets. And what about Sarah, the enslaved woman who was this young man's mother? We know almost nothing about her. We don't know if she ever saw her son again after he was taken to be sold. We don't know if she knew about the scandal at the auction house. We don't know if Richard Waverley punished her afterward, and given what we know about how enslavers responded to any threat to their authority, that seems likely. We don't know if she was sold after Richard Waverley died. She's a ghost in this story, her perspective entirely absent, and that absence is itself a tragedy because she was the person who suffered most from all of this. The ripples of this story continued for years. Other wives of slaveholders in Richmond reportedly became more vigilant about watching their husbands. There were rumors of other women threatening to make similar public accusations if their husbands didn't change their behavior. The Richmond auction houses implemented new policies about limiting attendance at auctions, screening who could enter. They didn't want another public scene like the one that happened in August 1855. The system adapted to protect itself. But enslaved people in Richmond remembered. They told the story to each other, and they told it to their children after freedom came. It became part of the collective memory of Richmond's Black community, even if the specifics got blurry over time. It was a story about resistance, not the armed resistance of a slave revolt, but the resistance of speaking truth, of refusing to cooperate with the fiction that slavery was benign and orderly. Catherine Waverley's outburst, whatever her motivations, had disrupted the smooth functioning of the slave market. She had made people uncomfortable. She had forced them to acknowledge what they all knew but worked hard to ignore. And the young man himself, with his upright posture and his direct gaze, had refused to perform the expected submissiveness, and that too was a form of resistance. As we try to understand this story more than 170 years later, we have to grapple with what we don't know as much as with what we do know. We don't know his name. Let's call him Samuel, just to give him some identity in our minds, though that almost certainly wasn't his real name. We don't know if Samuel ever gained his freedom. We don't know if he lived to see the Civil War, if he escaped to the North, if he fought with the Union Army like nearly 200,000 formerly enslaved men did. We don't know if he had children, if his descendants are alive today, if somewhere there's a family that has handed down a story of an ancestor who caused a great scandal in Richmond before the war. What we do know is that Samuel's story, fragmentary as it is, represents the stories of millions of enslaved people whose names and lives were deliberately erased from history. For every enslaved person whose story has been preserved in some form, there are thousands whose stories have been lost entirely. And that loss is not accidental. It's the result of systematic destruction of evidence, of laws that prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write, of the burning of plantation records after the Civil War, of the deliberate efforts by former enslavers and their descendants to control the historical narrative. The lost story of Samuel, or whatever his real name was, is also part of a larger pattern of how American history has been sanitized. For most of American history, slavery was taught, if it was taught at all, as a regrettable but ultimately minor institution that didn't really affect most Americans. Textbooks described enslaved people as workers or servants. They avoided discussing the sexual violence that was endemic to the system. They certainly didn't discuss the market in enslaved people's bodies for purposes of sexual exploitation. They presented slavery as primarily an economic system about cotton and tobacco, not as a system of total domination that extended into every aspect of human existence. It's only in recent decades that historians have begun to tell more complete and honest stories about slavery. And even now, there's tremendous resistance to this work. When historians and educators try to teach the full truth about slavery, including the sexual violence, including the way enslavers raped enslaved women and then enslaved their own children, including the psychological torture of the system, including the active resistance of enslaved people, they face backlash. They're accused of being divisive, of teaching critical race theory, of making white students feel bad about history. But what they're actually doing is simply telling the truth. The story of the most beautiful male slave ever auctioned in Richmond is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be uncomfortable. It reveals aspects of slavery that many people would prefer not to think about. But if we're going to understand American history, if we're going to grapple with the legacy of slavery that still affects us today, we can't shy away from uncomfortable truths. So, what's the legacy of this incident? What does it mean for us today? First, it's a reminder that slavery wasn't just about forced labor. It was about total domination. Enslavers claimed ownership not just of enslaved people's labor, but of their bodies, their sexuality, their children. That level of absolute power over another human being created a society that was fundamentally distorted and corrupt. Second, it's a reminder of the complicity of white women in the system of slavery. It's easy to cast white women as victims of patriarchy who had no power, but that's not the complete truth. White women benefited from slavery. They used enslaved labor in their homes.